Welcome everybody to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism live for part 2 of our discussion with Samantha Youssef. If you missed part 1 yesterday on Saturdays with Renee, it won't impede you being able to, enjoy this video and get a lot out of it, but definitely go back and listen to that and check out all the conversations she's been having with Jared Ball on I Mix What I Like, and a couple of them on Black Liberation Media as well. And just, there's a body of work now that she's building in this YouTube space. So it's all worth looking into. And also, she has an upcoming episode on Within Our Gates that she recorded this week with Mtume. So, make sure to catch all of those things. Before we get into it, of course, like the video, help the algorithm, share it with folks, get it out there. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already. We're almost to 12,000 subscribers, which I'm feeling pretty good about. And yeah, I think there's the Patreon is probably in the show description as well. Support there. And then I think we also included Lifeline for Gaza. So definitely continue to support, Lifeline for Gaza, for folks who don't know, is a website that runs an algorithm that monitors close to now 1,000 survival funds in Gaza, and it lifts the ones who are receiving the least support up to the top so that you can see them. There's always a number every day who have not received a single dollar in the last 5 days, which can tell you that those families are starving, right? And so it's a great tool, I think, for folks who want to donate, but also for activists and organizers who are trying to do mutual aid work related to Gaza. So anyways, contribute to that, use it to find campaigns that need boosting, and share it with other folks in organizing spaces and so on. All right. So I think I just kind of want to pick up a little bit from where we left off yesterday. Um, I probably should do a bio and all that, but you're already on stage, so I'm not going to do that. And folks can check out yesterday's conversation to get a lot of your background. Obviously, I guess to say that you have a background as a visual artist, as an animator. You've worked with Disney, you've worked with video game companies, and so on and so forth. And I won't call you a whistleblower because that's not exactly right, but you are certainly giving us an insider perspective on a lot of areas of Hollywood production that I think people just don't think a lot about, is probably the best way to say it. And even here, we talk about media work a lot. I know Jared does a lot, but a lot of times we're kind of focused on the level of narrative, right? And like the storyline, the characters, like, maybe some of the, um, choices in terms of scenes and things like that. But we're not really thinking about some of the levels that you're much more conscious of, in terms of, the colors, the music, the all of the ways that visual and audio effects are, pulling us in, and what those things are encouraging us as audience to do and to kind of align ourselves with. And I think it's really great that you're sharing so much of that information. But to where we were in yesterday's conversation, I kind of want to pick up because we were in this conversation that Renee had us on about this kind of trajectory of Disney from this era where you had more what we would call like overtly racist, colonial, sometimes Orientalists kind of depictions often of non-white people around the world, right? Um, and then you kind of transition over time to what people now would call a kind of diversity, equity, inclusion. They might use that term derisively, like the right wing gets mad that, as we talked about yesterday, that there was a black Little Mermaid and those kind of things, right? But nonetheless, there's certainly a way that kind of a liberal politics of representation has become very important into a company like Disney, and I'd say into Hollywood much more generally as well. Um, and I think, I wanted to kind of give you a space to sort of maybe finish your thoughts about that transition between the kind of we were talking about Aladdin, for instance, as still
Yeah.
kind of orientalist in its framing of things, to one where you saw a more deliberate project of DEI. So maybe we could just start there and see if there's anything that you wanted to finish off talking about today with that.
Sure. Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to organize it all in my brain. I think in terms, I'll start just like with the culture a little bit inside, because we did talk about that yesterday, the kind of people that tend to populate these studios. And I was sort of replaying in my mind, like, listening to myself, like if I watch the video again, listening to myself actually helps me identify some of the things that I'm actually talking about. And there is this, because of the, like I said, this kind of very privileged, I guess is the best word, group of people that have not in their own personal life experienced the reality of any of these things or look at things through a very orientalized lens. It is very much that culture of I know on the Red Nation they said this about the Avatar thing, but like what settler or like colonization does, like this idea of like putting the skin of the like when you're sort of putting, like you're kind of appropriating and almost like putting on the skin of these other cultures. And that would be, I would argue that is actually sort of the way that it went in the second generation. So when I was talking about the 9 old men, like this new group of artists, these men, a lot of them that's how they looked at the diversity things. And that's why I was saying, like, for them, Aladdin wasn't any different than Beauty and the Beast, because they were just doing it as like costume changes and getting like sort of in their mind, they thought they were being very exploratory with these ideas. So a lot of those ideas came from that. And it was always trying to look for things like the way that decisions would be made were really about how could we create like a different film. Like it almost became like these appropriating things just got really popular. And I think that starts in school. Everybody in school was always looking for like a way to tell a story that would look artistically different or visually different. And that was often done through this kind of appropriation. And so, and like I was saying, at that stage in the company, this generation of people, like, I mean, they did have more creative control. There wasn't interference at that much that I was conscious of, at least, or that would have been visible, because you really were there like talking among each other about how to make this film. So a lot of these ideas that are problematic just came from inherited ideas, and that this demographic just doesn't have a consciousness beyond that space. And then when the 3D sort of takeover happened, that generation didn't want I think there's also the ego thing and the devotion to learning the hand-drawn craft and stuff too, but they didn't want to transition into 3D. They didn't want to have to learn a new medium that would put them, I guess everything that they've built and the status that they've acquired and all this stuff, they wouldn't have. Some of them, a couple of them did, but more of like the younger ones. A lot of them didn't want to. And because I can't remember which conversation I had brought this up in, but like when I started at Disney, we had these lifetime contracts. So that generation of people also, like if they, like Disney had to find a use for them. So what they did end up contributing to, the ones that stayed, were that they would do, and that's a lot of the work that I ended up doing as well in like later on, was what we would call draw overs, and we'd draw over the 3D animation to make it look more organic, and then they'd try to match our drawings like with the 3D artists would try to match it. But that didn't come until later, like trying to find a use for them. And so when I got into the studios, this transition was kind of already happening, but there was still, that opportunity. But then what ended up happening is we went abroad. And then when we were like abroad, they were constantly trying to push, like they were like, we'll give you 3D animation courses if you want, and you would get an open invitation to go to Pixar if you wanted to. And so they were kind of pushing that. And then what I noticed though is that once I left that space and started having to integrate, like sort of, because we did go abroad as 2D artists or whatever, and then coming back to the North American space or the studios where we did have to work in 3D. There was a big cultural shift, I noticed, like the kind of people that were being hired. And at the time, I mean, I've talked about this in interviews that I'd done in the past regarding just animation interviews or whatever. But the way that I used to describe it was like there was more of this fan culture that was coming into the industry, as opposed to artists that wanted to dedicate themselves to the craft of learning, because we would have to spend a lot of time learning to be animators. And then this trend changed in that people could do a 6-month course in software, or some people did a longer course where they did learn better animation techniques, but it became suddenly a very accessible space. And so from an elitist perspective, it did open up the space more, that more people that wanted to be involved in this industry, I guess, could like come into it. But it did start becoming more corporate. So you had people that were just very much like, they didn't understand anything about the art process, but they understood how to use the animation software. And the ones that would go into Disney would know like the fundamental animation techniques, like how fit, like to you, like so that the animation they produce with the software would look, believable. But they didn't really learn everything extensively, and they didn't necessarily learn about story or character design or all these different things. They just learned that. Whereas before we had to learn, we were constantly working in a much more fluid way, even when we had our respective roles at the studio. So that was a big shift that I noticed in the kind of people that would come in. And that's the other thing. There was sort of something that I was thinking about too, was this arrogance that sort of spreads across the industry. And I don't know who started this idea, but like it was very like well known that like it would be frowned down upon if you had an academic degree, like an undergrad or a master's degree, because it was seen as like, oh, like you couldn't get a job because you would be like, the respect was that you were learning, like you wanted to be in a really high profile studio, and that's where you got your education or something. So there was also this big discouragement of that. And also that lent itself into filtering us into these very specific kind of, training schools. So the other thing that I noticed is that just because I had done an art school program, so at least but I did, that was something I did on the side, was my academic journey was always part-time while I was working at the studios. But a lot of that, like it got worse in 3D, that you really had people that it almost mentally felt like they were like they came from high school. They did these very specific training courses where they didn't have to develop any other kind of life skills or responsibilities or anything. So you also just got this very like the toxic side of geek culture, I guess. Because I don't think all geek, but like just, the kind of stuff that when you read about like all of this kind of misogynistic toxic culture. So that sort of, I think also started shifting the culture as well. Like it just changed the demographic, and then the studios were becoming much more corporate, so they were much more siloed, and everybody was I think like what Mtume said in one of that I've heard you say, like these ottomans, right? The robot kind of mentality of like just learning, you stay in your little box. And then of course we have the tiers, so like you don't know, like you're the supervisor of an animation team just tells them what to do, and the supervisor might meet with the animation director, but there would be no opportunity to have any discourse between that, so sideways or up and down. So that was a really big cultural shift, and in that shift it came in with all of these DEI responses, that suddenly the films were being driven by that, like, and I guess that would be, for profit, for audience, and like for expanding audience engagement, for all the reasons that DEI is weaponized, I guess. That would be when that shift like happened, and it came along with that transition. So that's why yesterday I was kind of saying, even though these are all like Disney has always been in the same space, like in the same studio, like physically, these different generations have been like different well, maybe not the golden age guys, like the second generation from the Nine Old Men, but that post generation when it transitioned into 3D, that was definitely a different like, yeah, that really changed. It's almost like it's just a different company in a way. But there are some people from like the legacy thing, and there was also a thing where, you know, Katzenberg at that, like just before that transition happened, like Katzenberg was kind of, he opened DreamWorks during the transition because DreamWorks was still doing some 2D films, and then it went into 3D. So he took a lot of Disney artists with him. He gave them incentives to come with him, or like all this stuff. So he also took, so Disney was just, it got hit really hard by losing a lot of its artists to DreamWorks, and that transition. And like I said, internally, a lot of the old school people did not want to participate in the 3D thing, but they were still there. So there was still this facade of Disney structure still kind of being present, or people from the old era being present, but I wouldn't say that it was the same. And then people like myself and like maybe a couple other people that were maybe a bit younger that had this, that were part of the older, that got the education from the older generation, but were too young to maybe retire, or didn't have the status in the company to just sort of drift around and sort of find something for us to do. Yeah, I don't know if that like, so that's where I noticed.
Yeah. No, it is helpful. I want to apologize, first of all. I'm not doing a very good job hosting this morning. You know, we have Mtume Gant from Within Our Gates and Imperial 80s. We have Renee Johnston from Saturdays with Renee, and Jared Ball from I Mix What I Like, Saturdays with Renee, Black Liberation Media, and so on. Mtume, go ahead. I know you had something you wanted to jump in on.
So, yeah, you know, I mean, it's a shame that people couldn't hear the conversation Samantha and I had recently, because some of what I'm about to say touches onto it, but it actually expands on it. The generations thing is actually quite important, because I think people don't understand things like film schools and schools for this stuff in colleges are really a phenomenon of the 60s on. In the old studio system, there were no film schools. You were taken from places. You were, you know, has anyone ever seen like the film Barton Fink, right? He's a great playwright who's then told to come to Hollywood. That's how they got F. Scott Fitzgerald. We all know who that is. He was then brought to make screenplays. These advents are like things that kind of happen as the systems kind of grow, right? So in the 30s and the 20s and the 40s, you're getting apprenticeships, and they're going out and finding people in these ways, or just deputizing, this is the person's going to be, or you happen to know Walt Disney, so he's going to help you out, and he thinks you have the thing, right? And then in the 60s, you begin the development of these schools, things like USC starts, you know, these kinds of like film schools, audiovisual schools. You know, David Lynch tells a story about how he went to AFI. They begged him to go because they couldn't get anybody to go, which is wild to think, because AFI now is like 80 grand a year, and everyone's like clawing to go there, because if you get into AFI, it could be a ticket to get you into Hollywood. So what Samantha's saying about this like fan culture, that's kind of what happens, because once these kind of new establishments are developed, right? And the film school is the thing. USC, Martin Scorsese went to NYU, Oliver Stone went to NYU, Spike Lee, the names go on and on, the Coen brothers, and you begin to build these institutions, and then people want to go to these places. This is what largely what Samantha and I talked about, and learn the right way to do stuff, to get into the industry, to get part of the feeding line, right? It's a feeding line. You know, I have a friend, she went to USC after about 10 years kind of fledgling around Hollywood, not really getting her career going. And she said she went to USC so she could A, get on the conveyor belt to Hollywood, which she got on it, and she's now in Hollywood, and B, learn what the right way to do things once I get there. Right. So you already see this kind of mentality of indoctrinating people on a particular structure. And it's just kind of grown and grown and grown. And then as technology has changed, and a lot of like old guard ways of doing things are like kind of like going out of fashion, these schools and their kind of really doctrinaire way of telling people to do things, they become, you know, hegemon. And that's how we all are thinking. And the other thing is the money cycle kind of goes through, like Dr. Dre gave like 30-40 million dollars to USC like 10 years ago. He gave a ton of money to them. And like, to me, I'm like, all I can think about is, well, what kind of system in the music business culture does that mean? He's not giving them just money because he likes it. He's giving them money because they're going to be in league and producing some kind of system, some kind of feeder system for the entertainment industry that he's very much a part of through the various tentacles that he does that goes beyond music. It's not just music. Dr. Dre is one of the most important entertainment people in LA there is. There's like stories that like he runs parts of LA that you don't even realize, right? So I mean, it just goes into that. It's a really important point that Samantha is bringing up here. This, like, the way the generations have changed and how it's changed the mentalities of people, and thus I think made a worker public that's just more agreeable to kind of do what's this is. They're told to get ahead.
And just real quick, since the two of y'all threw me down the rabbit hole, and Mtume just brought up USC, just a reminder that USC has an entire department that's like associated to AI and military research and the whole thing that's funded by the Army. And, but part of what they did was hire the dude who directed Red Dawn to help run that department and to come up with ideas for it. So it's all like nastily, eerily, like connected, because they're all gross, but just saying.
Appreciated for the reminder of that rabbit hole, Renee. So one of the things you said in one of the conversations you had with Jared was you were talking about Andor, and this is just like a passing remark. You said something along the lines of, our job is to pull on people's hearts and minds, or to something to people's hearts and minds. And I reached out to you to ask you about it because I wasn't sure the degree to which that was something that you're actually told in Hollywood or at Disney or at, one of these companies, right? In some kind of, depoliticized kind of artistic way, right? Like, that's what we're here to do, is pull on people's hearts and minds. That specific term comes out of the history of counterinsurgency, and psychological warfare too. I mean, it's an idea that rather than just militarily suppressing a population, that your job is to convince them to be on your side, right? And so, it is used in, I mean, we could, obviously horrific examples going on in the world right now, but you even hear it in the rhetoric of someone like Netanyahu, who's, Israel's actively committing genocide, but as they're doing it, will say things like, well, if the Palestinians would just choose to live in peace and, get Hamas out of there, and this kind of stuff, then everything would be fine. We want them. We want, Palestinians to, we're on their side, kind of thing. It says the same thing about whether it's Syria or Iran, right? This kind of language where you're actually attacking, but at the same time, you're actually telling people that what you're doing is for their benefit and their freedom somehow, that it's just that we have to get rid of this one group of bad guys and bring you over to our side. And so I was just curious kind of the degree to which, if that was a conscious reference to that kind of military thought, or if that's really kind of how you are trained. And if so, what do you see a kind of connection between those things?
So my use of it was more of a conscious reference to what I was coming across in that distinction, that Alfred and Secker talk about how the Pentagon wants to be represented in a noble way, but the CIA is about hearts and minds. And but this is where I'm starting to realize that we've been it would be too obvious. I guess that's what I'm saying, is like they're training us. Like the more that I learn about and have and that's why I'm just really even, this is another conversation I'd love to have with Jared, like just in terms of the psychology inside the military or something, because I think it would it would be too obvious, but they're doing the same things. We just call it emotional engagement or intellectual engagement, and that crafting a good story needs both like emotional resonance or emotional engagement and this sort of intellectual juxtapositions of ideas. So that's where in some of the critiques that I've done, and that will probably continue, I'll continue to point this out in Andor, but I also brought it up in my Black Panther thing, this presentation of alternate ideas and then setting it up to show that they weren't a good idea. So it's almost like, you know, that like, which we see in being done in the news, but it's done more cleverly in film, because the way that they'll present it is that they'll use one of the character devices that they get, because that character device will have its own emotional journey and arc, but that character device represents like maybe a counter narrative, which could be revolutionary or something, but through their arc and through the personal association with them, we will show that it was a bad idea, and that on a subconscious level associates those ideas with that type of person, and then sort of neuters that discourse. And the series will always play out, the film or the series will play out like as if this was, you know, that it was clearly the right decision was to follow the value system that the CIA is trying to put through. So but that's where, you know, the more that I've like, again, like putting it in that framework of that we are propagandists suddenly makes me look at all the literature that I engrossed myself in and the workshops and the training and everything that we had, because everything, you know, and I said this in the Andor conversation, everything is about building this feeling. And I had mentioned that we're very snobby about it, but we are, like, the way that we understand, like, for me, when I criticize a film, I'm not looking at it in the way that, you know, this was something like, I don't want to say, like, I mean, this is what we talked about in our podcast, right, with Mtume, with Mtume, but like, this idea of like the feeling, and I'm really realizing that, and I think, you know, for me, I was a prime candidate to be a person in this venue because, you know, I really loved ballet, and I really loved, like, I remember even like there's this one conductor, he from Russia, and when you listen to his interpretations of the classical music, like it was just, I was crying, like it was just so beautiful and so emotional. But when you think about it like in that way, or with ballet, for me, when I judge it, like when I look at the ballet dancers that really resonated with me, it requires that mastery and perfection of technique or of your language. And I'd say this is the same in writing or poetry, this ability to use the language so beautifully, or to be so perfect, like the aesthetics of it are so perfect, but then what you want to do is you don't stop at being a perfect like aesthetics person. It's about using that to express a level of beauty and emotion that is just so just so moving. And that's always what got me with these higher and art things. And that's how we, in our part of the industry, even though these are blockbusters, you know, these are not like, I wouldn't like say that this is like, well, I guess in America it is culture, but the approach and everything behind it, like that is what we do, is did we get the feeling? Does it resonate? Like, did we capture that? That drives everything above all else. And we will delete things in the story. We will change things even in the narrative of events, you know, that people, like a lot of people get caught up in these narratives, like it's like history, like, but you could tell the story of someone in history and it could have a completely different resonance or impact on the audience and give a very different message depending on how you contextualize it and create like empathy for certain characters or not, or different things. And so that's why, like, you know, the pushback that I get when I'm criticizing these worlds like Star Wars, and the kind of pushback that I might have been like, I recognize it because I was a Star Wars fan, so I like recognize where the defensiveness is coming from, because you create this really incredible history of events and everyone wants to claim that they know the history of the events a bit, but what makes them really powerful, the ones that are considered canon or the ones that really resonate with people, like what drove it is this level of excellence that then allows you to transcend it and create a really powerful feeling in the audience. And that is like every film that we look at on our side that we're criticizing or studying is always based on that. Like, that's the thing. Our film school training is not like academic film school training. It's not about like the history of the film or how this relates in the world. It's which ones were just so emotionally resonating. So a lot of our film school training doesn't even start, you know, before World War II, or it is maybe with films like Casablanca is one that we resonate, like we study a lot, but that was also because it created, you know, like Rick represented like American values, and they say it was very like politically charged. Like the underlying narrative was really about reinforcing all these American values. So these are the films that we honor and study, and for their effectiveness in that emotional resonance. And now I feel like I've kind of gone on a bit of a tangent. I don't remember what I was starting. Oh yes,
No.
Hearts and Mind. So I started using Hearts and Minds because I was like, this is what it is. This is what they are training us in. But I think it would be, we would have, like, somebody would have figured it out if it was called Hearts and Minds. So it's called emotional resonance and it's called intellectual resonance. And that is more important than anything else. Yeah. So that's why I do think that like we are an excellent propaganda. And that's why when I, like, you know, when I was starting to put these pieces together, that's, you know, that's sort of why I made that Instagram video and stuff. And I was trying to contextualize it in that way for people to sort of frame it that way. But yeah, I hope I answered.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Jer. No, that was great.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to throw in that I feel like there's some parallels, though I think it started a little earlier with journalism schools of doing the same thing, of the industry just saying, we don't want to have to train people once they get here. We'll have them pay for their own training and couch it in degrees. And then there was, at the time I was in grad school at least, was an ongoing battle over, is this a trade school or is this an intellectual academic social science? And that argument continues, and the idea being that, so that's one way I see the overlap. The other one that I noted was that, the point that one of the reasons why I think we would see these similarities in Hearts and Minds and use of the language and the approach is that they're all euphemism. This is all euphemism. They're all doing the same thing. And whether it's the militarized foundations of media studies and mass communication in this country, or the connections I'm sure we're going to get to more with the military directly being involved with filmmaking and the purposes there, it just makes sense. So the same emotional connections they want us to engage to sell a product or to buy into a president or even a national identity goes into the process of creating those connections within the film. Makes sense, at least, that would all be the same or similar, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating too, because I can't help but think a little bit about Disney as a person, and also his mentality, you know, because like it's not just that he was racist, he was, but like if you go to Epcot still, you know, you will go through his like history of language. It's like a history of like I forget what he calls it, but it's basically a history of literature, right? It's like starts from this very, you know, writing on papyrus, like this kind of stuff, but it's almost all European. Like there's one reference to Islamic societies that preserve some of the European things during the Dark Ages, not that they created their own. This is the way it's framed there. And then there's the reference to Egypt, you know, because of papyrus and this. But other than that, as far as I remember, there's no reference to any other culture or civilization or society, right? And so it's all just like a history of events within Europe, basically around the creation of, you know, arts and literature, basically. And that's that globe. If people have seen it, that's what's inside. That is a ride that takes you through this history. And like the actual park at Epcot is this space that's designed after the old World's Fairs, where it has like all of these different, you go to visit all of these different places. But, you know, you would come away from it thinking, oh yeah, America's better than all of this. Like, because, and especially, I mean, the ones that are nicer are the European ones, right? Like Paris is kind of nice there and stuff like that. But like, you know, for the most part, there's a clear intention to still show other parts of the world as primitive and like it's still a very colonial gaze. And so I also think it's interesting just that you mentioned that within Disney, like the internal training is the thing that they most prioritize. That makes sense to me that they wouldn't want folks. I mean, what Jared's point is good too. I think between like the difference between a trade school and then, you know, what you're talking about, which is like academic critical engagement around film and film history and so on, that they have no interest in that, you know, probably because of how critical that kind of pursuit can be. And similarly within journalism schools, right? Like they don't want you to be too critical about what you're doing, learning the craft of journalism, because you're supposed to be a propagandist for the newspaper or the TV channel or whatever. That's all really interesting. I do want to get to because you've talked about the transition to 3D a lot. You referenced it yesterday. I know it's really so. One of the things you said yesterday was this was very much foisted upon people. And then I know you've referenced how like the sort of cutout of Pixar, there's also Lucasfilms, there's these entities that, as you say, are like they're very interwoven with you know, military and kind of technology, you know, military tech funding and this kind of stuff. So talk a little bit about that transition and what you think, well, who benefits from it? Like how do, you know, just talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there were like, I guess since I've already given a bit of that backstory with the like even the DEI thing and stuff like and you know, the ballroom thing, I do remember and being in school, because like the school I went to, a lot of our teachers came from Disney, and studios like ILM were sort of just like, I forget when did Jurassic Park come out? Like in the 90s, I think. And they were just kind of like late 90s, right? Mid-late 90s. They were just kind of flexing then. Like it was the first time that they were able to flex and show that they had gotten 3D to a certain level. And Toy Story was, you know, alongside this. And so, and this studio, like Jurassic Park, this was part of ILM, which is part of, you know, Industrial Light and Magic, which is sort of the animation division of Lucas film. And this, and again, like, you know, we think of it, like, it's just so weird because these things were just so exclusive. Like, you know, you have the Skywalker Ranch and then the studio is on it. And all of these studios, to go into them, you have to go through so much security just to get into these lots and these spaces. And it was always interesting to me. I'm like, it's so weird that ILM and Pixar are in San Francisco, and because everybody else was in LA. And then and I remember sorry, because I'm just trying to tell it as a story a bit too, like use my narrative powers or something. But I also remember when I was a little kid, you know, I said I grew up in this really Zionist neighborhood, and we had neighbors temporarily that were from Switzerland, and they were working a lot on developing 3D software for research at the university here, which I found out, like, as I've been, you know, rabbit holing, because I had a friend that's in math, and I found out she does particle differential equations, which is, you know, basically like the university here collaborates a lot with Tel Aviv, and these are equations and simulations that they'll do to see how much to calculate the amount of like spray or something that different materials can have. So I think it's really, I think this is probably developed more for domestic warfare so that they can do these kind of see how much damage is impacted in like a small space or whatever. but they were part of like, you know, sort of developing this software. So when I was a little kid and they knew that I loved animation, they gave me this VHS tape that I later, like, that was full of these, like the Luxo lamp, you know, from Pixar. It was early Pixar tests, and it was collaborating with these people here in Montreal, you know, but, you know, at the time I was like, oh, and Pixar hadn't like released anything yet. So then when Toy Story came out, I was like, I even have a tape that shows this little lamp. And there were some other things. Like I remember there's like a Crest toothpaste commercial with a 3D like blob of toothpaste or something. So they had other tests that they were doing. But now when I look back, I was like, there was even this relationship that I just like that was happening through here. And then like, you know, I was still a kid when all these films came out. So to me, I was just thinking of them like, oh, it was a different animation medium. And it was just sort of a natural evolution of the industry. But when I got into school, because we did have people come in that had worked on Jurassic Park, and some of our teachers, and they had all like they're all like alumni from this program. And that was always an internal conversation, sort of the transition into 3D, or from this second generation or like Renaissance generation of artists too. A lot of them were like, I don't know if it was their egos or whatever, but they were always very publicly outspoken against like transitioning. Like, you know, like they were too good to transition to 3D, and they were right in certain things, because even for myself, like coming from a 2D background, these were just internal things that we were like, it's, you know, even though 3D made it more accessible, just for audience members to understand how this works, 3D is really like a stop motion. It's like a virtual stop motion animation. You create a virtual set in 3D, and then you have a sort of a puppet that you animate. So, but the thing is, like, so if you're very restricted by the puppet. So it's like if you were doing your own stop motion on your phone or something, and you just had like a very basic toy that could just do this, you're not going to get the range of emotions that you can see, let's say in a Disney film, or expressions or whatever. It's definitely improved, but it's been such a journey for artists to find out how to do this. And like for the issue that I always had was, yes, it takes you a very long time to learn drawing skills to become a good because that's the other thing. Like a lot of people like drawing for animation requires like very intense draftsmanship training, because it's not about doing a drawing, it's about controlling the drawing through space, that the lines don't jiggle. So you have to really think like a sculptor. You have to be able to like really understand what you're drawing, and that takes a long period of study. But once you have that mastery, you're not restricted by anything. Whereas 3D animators are always restricted by what we call the rig, or the puppet. And so this, in this transition period, it was just very irritating, because you couldn't even do what you wanted to do. You were stuck with these puppets that weren't developed very well yet. And so it was through like this just constant grinding of work, trying to get it to where it needed to be. And so, you know, I remember like every artist that was in the industry just was resisting it. It wasn't something that was welcomed. It wasn't something that like felt like it made things better. It was actually like a lot of work to try to integrate it. Now where it's gotten to, you know, the industry's almost become like you couldn't produce a film without it, you know, like, or something. And the schools changed now, you know, like I was saying, that now people only train in this. But I do remember, you know, like all of my teachers talking about this, and even my work, like when I go into studios that do higher end work, like let's say ILM, they do have the processing power to create better things now that could look more realistic, but we have to figure out challenges like because like, for example, let's say you're doing a dinosaur or something in Jurassic Park. It was a lot of work and probably a lot of heavy lifting, but in real life you have bones and muscle and sinew and skin that are built on top. But most of these rigs in 3D are like a cylinder, like they're like a puppet, they're like a balloon, and they have a wire through them that moves the balloon around. So deformations, you'll probably notice this in films. It's gotten much better now, but if you go back 10 years, deformations, like when an elbow bends, start looking a little wonky, because it really is like bending a tube. It doesn't move like with muscles that kind of overlap and make these shapes. And to create those kind of layers causes so much rendering power, like it's almost impossible. And most animators wouldn't even know what to do with them if they had a puppet that was that complex. So like there were just a lot of things that, you know, made like it required a lot of effort and work, but the studios seemed to be like fine with that it slowed things down or made things more difficult. And so for me, it was just always this thing like I never liked 3D, but I did learn it and I did have to work in it. And my work eventually became that I was trying to make it look more organic. I ended up going back to drawing more, but I would work with 3D animators. So just to rewind all of that, when I started doing my research for my graduate studies, as I was going, you know, when I was doing this research, I was initially thinking of like looking for these military interactions because of like propaganda, but there were things that had come up too. Like I remember it was about 6 years ago or 7 years ago, because I only consulted in video games, but like, well, no, that's sorry, I should rewind more. But one friend was saying, oh, there's this new startup gaming company, but like it's this new thing and we get a lot of freedom and it's a much better work environment. And it was started by a company that does a lot of the UK's security defense systems. And then they were making a gaming thing. And I was like, and there was something in my mind always like, why are these games always so violent? Why are these games always like focusing on military? Because I'd look at some Japanese games like Super Mario Brothers and stuff. And I think I haven't delved into that. I'm sure there's a whole problematic history there. But at least some of the games were like, the games were not always rotated around shooting or killing. You could just jump around on little mushrooms or like something like that. And there was also, in my consulting experience, it was very short. I was at Ubisoft, but I was in a division called Hybrid. And this division, we were working on cinematics. So I didn't work in-game. And the in-game, like there's in-game artists operate very different. You have to work with different constraints and different things. So it's kind of a different area in a way. But I was there in the cinematics department. We were with a company that was called Hybrid, which was sort of a different branch. And we had to sign extra NDAs, and nobody from the in-game, even though we were working on like cinematics for the games that other artists were working for, nobody was allowed in our department. And I had to go through 3 security doors just to get to my wing that other people didn't have, like we had pass access. And I just remember, like, I always used to joke, it's like, it's not like we're in the military or something. Like, why is it? And I used to say that like all the time, like, this is so ridiculous, you know? And even at Disney, when I started, and, you know, because I was still in my teenage years when I started at Disney. So like mentally, there was a part of me that thought it was kind of cool. Like I was at Disney and we had to do a finger scan and an access code to get in. And I was like, oh, this is like Mission Impossible, you know? And I like in my mind, I thought that was, at the time, it kind of was something that I thought was fun. You know, now they've got my fingerprint on file or whatever. But there were just these weird things. So when I would hear somebody talking or referencing something like that, I started just like archiving stuff, you know, like, this is weird. And then when I was doing my research studies, I came across this article by Tim Lenoir called All War is But a Simulation. And in reading it, I think it just made me feel so sick. Like I felt sick because it was putting together all of those things that I just told you. It pieced them together. It talked about how DARPA was investing in a program at the University of Utah to develop technology for remote warfare and drone warfare and rendering technologies, because all these things need to move through virtual space, and the speed at which they need to render it in their own processor to understand the depth or what they're navigating, or if it's slippery or if it's not. They needed to develop this. And the software that they developed was called RenderMan, which is Pixar's proprietary software. And that really resonated with me because we all know RenderMan. That's like one, and they worked with other companies like Autodesk. The main thing that's used in the industry is Autodesk Maya is the most popular. And then certain companies have their own proprietary software that's like Pixar's RenderMan. So what they realized is that they couldn't field test enough to develop the software the way they needed. But what they discovered is that when creative people got involved, artists got involved, they were recreating worlds that brought up challenges that could help accelerate the development of this software. And I have the article, like I highlighted the little, notes and stuff, like if you want me to read some of that later or whatever, but there were just certain moments that so they basically, so they were trying to get more artists involved. And I think that they struggled with that. So eventually they created Lucasfilm, and then out of Lucasfilm came Pixar. And then here's another, and so I just logged that away. And then I was, we were talking about certain problematic figures in terms of like sexual predators and stuff in the industry. I was having a conversation with someone, and I was just like, we were talking about the alleged sexual offenses of John Lasseter. And so I was just looking him up on Wikipedia, and what do I see is that he was fired from Disney for trying to push 3D animation. And then immediately the next day went to oversee, he was given a $5 million signing bonus and a $2.5 million a year salary to be the head of Pixar. And as someone that's worked as an animator at Disney Studios, which is the position that John Lasseter had, at the time he was not a producer, he's not anything. So he was just a random employee that was trying to, I'm assuming, got paid by somebody to try to get Disney artists on board. So at least props to Disney that at the time they rejected him. But the mythology in my industry because John Lasseter is given so much prestige and platforming that we don't even know why, so many people are always spouting his praises. We don't even know why. I've always asked that. I'm like, his artwork was never good. Why? What is this person doing? But he's considered, a legend. And you will see so many animation blogs and people that will say Disney didn't see what his vision was. He was such a visionary and all this stuff. So I guess initially they needed artists, and Disney was where they thought they could find these people. And I guess Disney, refused this integration or use for R&D of their studio. So then they made Pixar, and then they had to get people and build it and grow it and build that artistic team. And then at some point, they come back on, and this is with that transition, then that's when Pixar and Disney merge. And this happened under Eisner and Katzenberg, who both have very deep, entrenched, problematic histories. And I also think, when I'm thinking of those things, again, I don't know if this is true, but I'm just saying these are things that I just always wondered about. And this kind of ties into the question we were having about ideology versus capital, or also I kind of am bringing that in there because I also remember there were periods where there was one point where Katzenberg put DreamWorks Animation up for sale. The company was not doing very well. And in the understanding that I had when I was more neoliberal spaces and didn't really understand imperialism, for me, I was like, oh, why doesn't he just sell his software? Because Primo is known to be the best software, hands down, in the industry. And he guarded it religiously. You would only have it at DreamWorks. But I remember going into DreamWorks, because if you're at Disney, Pixar, or DreamWorks, it's basically because we're so elitist even within the industry that's a circle that all knows each other, but you wouldn't necessarily know each other at the lesser studios or whatever. So, you're always drifting in and out of these spaces. And Primo was really amazing, in terms of its organic integration, everything. It was one of the better softwares. And I'd always just be why doesn't he just put it on the market? Why doesn't he just sell it? Why is he selling his company? And because I know he has a lot of ties, I don't know. I don't want to jump to too many conclusions, but he also has ties with a particularly other government. And I wonder if this software is to that government what RenderMan is to the Pentagon. I don't know. I'd love to call upon the people actually that do these 6-hour critiques of Easter eggs, because that is an untapped talent that could prove really useful here. But all of those things just kind of came crashing together in my mind when I was reading this article, and Tim's article just made so much sense. All the things that I was why did they do this? Why did, yeah, it was just very, it was very disturbing to read that, because I've witnessed the transition a little bit. And yeah, and and that's the thing, I think to what Mtume was saying with the schools, that I hadn't even thought of that. And that makes so much more sense too, because then they're training people. And I think that's also the pushback in my industry, that there's such an identity, like there's so much ego and identity associated with what we do. But when I've tried to talk to people about this, I get the most pushback from like software engineers or people, like, because their whole life now is tied to this software. Like they don't have if you remove that software, they don't have a job, they don't have a skill set, they don't have, I mean, I personally think they have their thinking skills and that they could find something else. Like I believe in that, but I think the way they see it also, it would be a hard pill to swallow. But that's, yeah, sorry, I'll stop because I want to give space for a conversation.
No, I feel like you should just keep talking because you just know the things. But you brought up Utah, and I was like, why is Utah like standing out in my brain as something? So it's interesting when we're always trying to make these connections. So something that I think people should understand about the University of Utah is that it is also home to one of the largest public safety departments that exists on a university campus. And in 2022, they went as far as to open a brand new 25,000 square foot public safety department that cost them $14.5 million to build. And it's part of the University of Utah. And it neighbors another policing facility that was, under construction as of like 2023. Mm-hmm. So, when we talk about, the military and the international militarization, I'm trying to make sure that people always make the connection between that and the internal police state, right? That's here nationally, because it's all connected and they're all working for the same people and they're all part of the same system of oppression. So this is why we always want people to be mindful that when we talk about Palestine, it's not because we just want to recognize oppression on the other side of the world. It's because the same people and the same tools that are oppressing Palestinians are oppressing people here and oppressing people in Haiti and oppressing people in the Congo. Like it's all connected. So I just wanted to make sure, like, since you said the University of Utah, it just popped in my head, like that's on my map and there's a reason that's on my map. And so I went to look it up and that was why. Yeah, no, but to your point, like that's exactly, that's what we're seeing now. It's all to process it's and if they can't keep us pacified by the entertainment and the soft power manipulating that they're doing through films and through media, then they'll use that hard power. Well, they're already doing that. They're already, but yeah, it's I mean, there's so much more like I want to go into, but I also want to, I don't want to move away from ILM yet. So maybe we should stay on like.
Yeah, I'll jump in. But a quick, not joke, but it's an anecdote, but it's not an anecdote. I think that's actually just to my school. Film students in film production places, they hate film studies. They don't care. They actually don't care about film history. They don't want to watch Battleship Potemkin. All they want to know is how to make the movie right so they can get the job and please the audience. Now, there's obviously a bad mentality right there, because if you do film studies, you can probably learn that. But I think the point is really important. Is I'm in this film, I teach at a film production school, and we have this problem where students don't want to learn film history. They largely don't care of it, especially if you politicize it. If you make it material, right, and not just about people's feelings, and I mean feelings in the sense of like nostalgia or what they think is good based on their subjectivity, but actually getting into the material history of how film is made and developed. You get a small percentage of film production students who care about that. So that says, if they're given an ideology of what's supposed to be the thing they're supposed to go out and make movies and how they're supposed to make movies, they're just going to take it, especially if you're told that this skill set is what's going to get you a job, right? And or help you become Christopher Nolan, whoever you aim to be. The second thing I really wanted to kind of get into is, one of the things with ILM that people need to also remember is because of ILM and George Lucas that we have digital cameras as the main thing of movies. He was the person who took it on in the 90s with The Phantom Menace. That was him, right? And, you know, you can see it in my recent conversation with Dwayne Monroe. Digital cameras aren't a thing that movie filmmakers and cinematographers asked for. This wasn't a thing that, you know, cinematographers were like, man, you know, I don't really want to use celluloid anymore. I could really care less, right? Editors weren't, Walter Murch wasn't sitting there going, oh, please, you know, take me off of my, you know, big editing bay. Like, you know, probably wanted to be a little bit, actually, no, though Murch was very much against a lot of the Avid stuff. If you read his book In the Blink of an Eye, he's actually was very antagonistic towards, even when you were still on celluloid and some of the computer tech was coming into it. He had a lot of complications and didn't love it, right? So this wasn't something they asked for. It was something imported. And in my conversation with Dwayne, because one of the things that he had showed me was how much of camera use was for taping nuclear testing in Hollywood, by the way, in Laurel Canyon and all those places right there, like the nuclear tests. And then some research I had been doing about, you know, things like gun cameras and the military needing to have cameras that were smaller, right? That could be less detected, that had a greater speed, that could eventually, this is where things like internet technology gets really important, that could be where footage could be transported without having to actually take a canister that's developed. And the person, I forget his name, who worked on the brain, he was a military person. Like this was his brainchild, and he brought that out to places like Sony and all types of stuff. So it's like, if you start digging into all of it, and then Lucas is with The Phantom Menace is the reason why you have digital technology, because his big argument was, and it was an argument on capital. He wanted to sit there and basically edit while he went. He didn't want to spend as much money, right? And they wanted, and eventually it had a lot to do with what Samantha was talking about, graphics control, how they can do things with 3D operators, and, you know, they can make more mistakes, right? Or these types of things. It just changes the mode of production, but it was not something that the artists asked for. It was not a request of cinematographers to have these digital cameras, right? It was an import of the industry and an import from technology that had a lot to do with our military and imperialist history. So it is very curious things to think about.
Yeah,
Can I ask a question real quick? And only because I feel like you all will know the answer to this. And it's like a chicken or the egg question. So, like, is the military creating these devices and giving them to Hollywood and art to test, to make sure that things work, and to get people used to the idea of these things, so that when the military uses them, it's not as like off-putting? Or is it people in the corporate area of the artist world, the video world, creating these things so they can profit better and then selling them to the military? Like, is it the chicken or the egg? Do we know? Are they working in tandem? Is it like
yeah. No, I thought about that a lot. I'll tell you what I think. Like, after reading these articles and sort of placing it together with my experience, at least in the realms that I work in, I think I would just present option number 3. They're not separate. These industries were created by the military, in the same way that when the Pentagon saw the effectiveness of Birth of a Nation, they knew that film was very important. And I would argue that the takeover probably happened more than 100 years ago. And these developments and different branches it's all part of the same corporate entity in a way, and they're just different departments. So they'll always work in some kind of collaboration with each other. And it's probably a bit of both, of like what you said, that like, oh, it might benefit this, like, you know, that maybe within their little things, they're like, oh, the budget, it would be great to have more of the budget here so we can, but and the reason I say that is because I also think, you know, like, my understanding is the Pentagon has not been audited in like forever. And I think something that people are not paying attention to is how much millions or billions of development is happening under the guise of entertainment. Because like when you think of like I would encourage people to read that article by Tim Lenoir, because there's basically a through line from Toy Story all the way to drones identifying and sniping children in Gaza. That's what it was built. That's what Pixar was building towards, is to be able to do what we're witnessing in the world now. And like, there's also the whole animatronics and robot development. And when you look at some of these productions, and Renee, you were getting me thinking of that yesterday too, you know, because when you're like, is it cheaper? Because they used to build the sets. They're still building sets, but they build robotics. And they, and there's this whole thing about Imagineering. And our friend John Lasseter just keeps popping up everywhere because he's the creative, or he was up until this like harassment scandal. He was the overseeing creative consultant of Disney Imagineering, which produces builds all of their electronic robotic components. I mean, it could just be for the theme park. I'm just curious. And that's the other thing, like the other things that, you know, you start like the relationships that I've seen, like in Quebec, for example, in Canada, a lot of these 3D gaming studios, they've been here for decades because there's tax, like that's where there's tax breaks. Nobody asks why are there tax breaks, all these things. It's just kind of like, oh, it helps the economy, or there's tax breaks. The government here will pay 40, like it was 37%. I think they're reducing it a little bit now to 30%, but 37% of all employees' salaries are paid for by our tax dollars for companies that are private, you know, companies. And I was starting, you know, as I've been going down this path, Ubisoft that sort of set up the industry here, like they've been here the longest, and they're one of the larger studios because they're like probably 4,000 people now, or maybe more, I don't know. I started doing a little bit of digging and it turns out that Ubisoft is owned by these 4 brothers called the Guillemot brothers. And they have a company called the Guillemot Corporation. And this company, so they produce all their games at Ubisoft and software development, but this company also has, and I just want to add that Ubisoft has a history of sexual harassment allegations, that they just finished that big lawsuit in Europe now about it. So I find that the name is fitting. They have a company called Thrustmaster. And this company, Thrustmaster, makes all kinds of simulation control. You go to their page and you just scroll down and they're like, we have a long history with the American military. And they develop all of these like controls for planes. I don't know if they're actually used in jets, but they definitely develop the whole, like the hardware of like a simulation software. I'm not sure how deep this like if those are actually controls that are used on the, like, you know, that they develop the hardware for the jets or the planes, because Canada does a lot of military parts components, but then this is all put under the guise of entertainment and stuff. And so there's just, and then the reason that I'm bringing up the Ubisoft hybrid thing, like, so after I did that little deep dive, as we were looking, I was looking at the Andor credits and I was like, how interesting, because Star Wars is religiously usually always done in-house. Marvel, they'll outsource to 3D studios around the world. And I think Star Wars is sort of bleeding into this now, but initially it was always meant to be kept inside Lucasfilm. And on Andor, it is mostly kept on Lucasfilm, except for a small party that actually is doing effects called Hybrid, Ubisoft Hybrid, that was there in the Andor credits. And then there's also credits that show in Andor their military advisors, Phil Kimber, Wayne Hoyle, and Rupert Fine. And one of those, I couldn't find any information on the third, but one of them does a lot of training in future, like technological, remote, and future warfare. And the other one does a lot of training on leadership and psychological development of people in the military and how to psychologically. So these are these are the story writers. Like these are the people that you know, then you hire a director and you hire a screenplay writer to fix things. But like, just even looking at that, because I was just from our Andor conversations, I was looking at those things. So all of this to say is, like, I used to think it might be a separate entity that colludes on occasion. I don't think it is. Like, I think at the top of it, it is just a department of the state at this point, and they make a lot of money by going under this. Like just like what if I look at the Ubisoft example, that they make a lot of money. They get these tax breaks for whatever reason. But this is a private company. That's not going back to our pockets. This is like a private company that the government here is paying for up to 40% of employees' salaries to develop software interfaces. And then they sell these products and people test it out and people say, oh, the interface doesn't really work too well. I don't like this. This would be more organic, and get all the feedback from your customers for free. And then you develop it and refine it. And so I really think that they're part of, I think that's what we have to sort of go back. And I don't know when or if the industry as Hollywood exists was ever independent. I would say maybe filmmakers were independent, or filmmaking was independent before the early 1900s, but sometime around World War I, propaganda, and all of the initial research and writing on propaganda came from that period too, right? Like, so I would argue that it was probably, this industry was built for that reason. It wasn't built by artists or filmmakers, and that they all just happened to come together in California because it was great and easy for all of them to be there. I think it, again, like I don't know for sure, but this is what I want to research more. But that's kind of.
I mean, yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, to study the development of even film, it's largely a capitalist endeavor. I mean, the Lumiere brothers were factory owners, right? And what are some of the first films that they shot? People walking out of their factory happy. And this is during the time of, like, you have socialism and communism rising in. I mean, they were French, right? You're not far from the Paris Commune and worker revolts happening in Europe. So they need to use celluloid to kind of display this idea that, the factories are happy and the workers are chilling, right? So it's always been a ruling class endeavor. And then largely what you get when you get to early celluloid is the nations looking to compete with technology, saying who's the best. So the US is using film, Britain is using film, France is using film, Germany is using film as a way to show that we have the technological wherewithal to be the hegemonic leader of the Western expansion, so forth and so on. So yes, it's always been a project, an imperial project. It's been really a part of it. I mean, Jared and Ware and I, when we did Forgeries in Memory and Meaning, I mean, Cedric Robinson gets into this from the American, but not just the American context. He does talk about the tug of war that was happening internationally, using film as a propaganda tool, and the tech, what we would call like a tech race, right? And the only other thing to add is, like, I agree with Samantha wholeheartedly. I think, I haven't done the digging when it comes to how the funding was happening in companies like, Kodak, Sony, so forth and so on. These are the names, Philips, that you will normally see with this stuff. But look, these places had huge R&D departments where people basically would just sit there and create technology in the 60s and the 70s. Where was this money coming from? I mean, like, my thing is then just look at it. That's where you would find it, right? If you want to know, find out how are these R&D divisions funded, and they couldn't just be funded by how much money they were making in the consumer market, because largely a lot of those companies back then weren't bringing in a lot from the consumer market. The consumers were very, very skeptical that these things were things they should be buying, right? I mean, look, read about the history of the Walkman and the CD player, right? These were things people were like, what? Like, we don't want this stuff. So where were they getting this R&D money to pay people really good salaries, right? Though a lot of those people also didn't get royalties from that development. If you look at the history of those people who are working in those R&D things, they don't get credits or royalties from these inventions that they made. But I would look there, like, who's funding the R&D, as Samantha pointed out with places like Ubisoft, it's military, right? So I think I would doubt that it was any different 40, 50, 60 years ago in the development of a lot of these other technologies that are now basically in our consumer life.
So I do tend to take even a grander cop out by just saying something akin to what Fanon said, that in a colony everything is intentionally racist. So there's no like we accidentally made a racist song, or and so in my point being, like in within a colonial relationship, any things could evolve somewhat autonomously or naturally, so to speak, or as a particular interest of a group or an individual set of researcher or whatever. But once the apparatus recognizes its value, it quickly gets plugged in. So so I don't know necessarily that. So for instance, my reading of the history of Hollywood isn't that it was created intentionally by the military. It was more that once it was realized that there is for lack of, for the sake of this stuff, a talent pool, and people have a certain interest and a desire among the ruling elite to get people away from elite culture like ballet and opera and into, vaudeville and something lesser for the common folks. I could easily see, as is the case with mass comm research, it just is like, oh, there are a group of people they call themselves sociologists and anthropologists and psychologists, and people are interested in art. Let's start funding a group and start making use of this, and then you can start to more target and more apply, get more specific, and then turn it into. For instance, I haven't read the article that you all were talking about that is in the show description, but the one that I was looking at in advance of today that I dropped in the private chat is making a similar case to the one I'm making, that the foundation of this Imagineering project and this dude Roy Farron is it seems as though in one read of this article that they found someone who they find people with a capability to create art and a certain talent, and then they just start bringing them in. And what I found to be most personally disturbing in this article is that this dude was involved in creating the visual narratives that would accompany Pink Floyd shows. And as someone who saw one certainly live under all the influences and loved it, I feel a kind of way that once again I got roped into being manipulated into experiencing something, and then they said, oh, this dude can make concert videos and narratives that accompany rock songs. Let's plug him into the broader political project of creating narratives that accompany all this other technology. And then he got into all the Imagineering stuff that you're talking about. Anyway, that's how I tend to see it, that they're just, we're all under a certain level of surveillance. And once we all produce something that is of value, kind of the point I was also making recently about scholarship, we can produce, like, all this stuff that we're producing is great and wonderful, but they're taking as much advantage of it. They're making as much use of it as anyone else, unfortunately. So, but yeah, anyhow. Go ahead.
I think you're right. I think the thing about the Pentagon, and military industrial complex, right, is like that there's so much money that they dole out in terms of research and development, right? A lot of it goes to the top line research institutions, universities in these these departments, like the one Renee's talking about at USC and other places. MIT is a huge space for this. Always a contradiction that gets brought up with Noam Chomsky, for instance. So that's part of it, right? And then they also invest R&D within private military contractor companies. And what's interesting, I think, about what you're talking about, Samantha, is that the technology that's developed in Hollywood, for instance, the technology that Pixar is developing to make something like Toy Story and to make all of these subsequent, 3D animated films, that there's a direct military utility to the development of that kind of visualization, which I think is not like when you first told me that, I would just have never thought of that. Like, and you know, you can start to look into like see the connections and so on. But, you know, I mean, talk about pernicious and nefarious, just the notion that this children's movie, and I will say the point you're making too about how this type of technology was foisted upon us in the 90s. If anybody wants to see a glaring example of this, go back and watch Beast Wars, which is like the Transformers. They transform into animals. It's this sub series of Transformers. It is some of the worst animation that you could possibly imagine. It's so bad, right? But this was a Saturday morning cartoon. And in this era where they're like trying really hard to get 3D going, and I just think and even if you go back and watch the first Toy Story and compare it to like later Pixar or DreamWorks pictures, you can see how amateur it is. And even as you're talking about how difficult it is to animate 3D, it makes sense when you think about Toy Story because they're so simple as toys that their facial expressions and things like that don't have to be that complicated, right? And so yeah, I just think it's fascinating to think about what that means to have an entire company kind of spun up and supported in order to create a technology that would develop to create better animation in the 3D space over time. But what's the purpose of being able to visualize in that way? And what utility does it serve for the US military or for surveillance and policing technologies? And I think for a tech company, like, it doesn't matter because to them, they're like, we just need to be able to sell this stuff. It's like the RoboCop thing, Mtume. It's like the guy at, what is it? OBC, what is it?
Dick Jones. You heard about OCP?
Yeah, OCP, right.
Yeah.
Is that he's like, I don't care if Ed 209 works or not. I don't care if he recognizes whether the civilian's putting the gun down. Like, I can sell this thing to the military and the police. And so it doesn't matter. And so, yeah, I mean, anyway, I don't know where you want to take us next or if you want to respond to anything folks have said, Samantha, but go ahead.
No, I like, it's just, I like just listening to, that overview too. And I was just thinking about it because on the artistic side also, like the reason that it had to be Toy Story or Bug's Life or DreamWorks did, I think Ants was their first one. Like we didn't have, like, it wasn't possible to create a non-creepy human at like even just as artists, like it was just too creepy looking. Like it wasn't possible to get like organic animation yet. So toys, robots, these things like lent itself, like, and we were very conscious of that. Like we just couldn't make films in that way. And I mean, I would argue like probably Tangled was the first successful human organic movement, and then that really did take like how like Disney then kind of got into like being much more competitive in 3D. I mean, Disney had Bolt and Chicken Little and stuff, but humans were still kind of creepy back then too. And so, but I even remember like in the 2D things, it's just that this took, like, that's the thing, like just going back to like artists not wanting it. When you look at the timeline, like realistically, it took more than 2 decades or about 2 decades to get it to a place where it actually then started having a bit more of an appeal among audiences, or that it could be visually appealing, because Tangled was like 2011. And in the 80s, like when Disney was like, again, like this was sort of when I guess Disney was starting to take on these contracts or something, like it would always be put in things like The Great Mouse Detective had this big clock. The mice were inside a clock and all these gears were like turning and moving in 3D. So that was how they integrated that. And then I think there was the ships in Little Mermaid at the end or something. They kind of put that in ships, and then the ballroom, like it goes to the ballroom scene in Beauty and the Beast or whatever. But it was always, or like in Treasure Planet, they had like the little robot characters, so they were able to get some character animation out of it, and they made him fully 3D with like a 2D shading kind of look. But that's the other thing too. It's like the animation I don't know how significant the quality, like even though the humans were quite creepy and organic, like I'm not clear exactly if the animation itself is significant as much as like the rendering of spaces, the rendering of 3D spaces. And maybe it is because that's the thing too, like you don't, like there's so many, like the software doesn't just happen, right? Like you have to like program in everything. So even for the software, like let's say they're trying to snipe little kids, for the software to understand what that movement is, that's like a human moving, it has to sort of build a puppet, and it has to understand in its mind, and it has to understand how that puppet moves. So I guess, in that way, everything that we create, as even if we're just trying, like on the artist side, that we're like, oh, we're just trying to get more believable human performance or something like that, those are actually significant things. And I remember, I think it was like a Code Pink post or something. There's like a woman that used to be a general, or she went to one of these she was kind of criticizing one of these military showcase things. She was just walking around and sort of pointing this out online. And there was one like really creepy, like this robot dog that, that we've seen, like at least I've seen on Electronic Intifada, that they're going through homes, right? And like with guns on their backs. But in this little showcase thing, and there's this little boy wearing this little shirt with like a rainbow and a dog or something on it. And this robot dog like the boy stands in front, they put the boy in front, like 3 or 4 years old, like tiny, little kid. And the robot dog explains, explains who the kid is, what's on his t-shirt, what he's wearing, like all of this stuff. And it can recognize that because of the artistic work that we plug into the software, like all of that nuance. And so, yeah, sorry. So I was just thinking, and the time I want to maybe just reflecting on what I just said, that I think it might've been in 1915. Like, I wonder if like 1915 or was more of like a CIA thing, and then Pentagon and military research development might have happened more in the 60s or 70s, like when these CG programs and robotics were starting to be built, because at least in the animation timeline, that's when they got, these studios started getting created. And then that's why I feel like Disney, to compare Disney to the company that it was, I think they're using it more as the facade of what it means for American culture. But it's not saying that it was an innocent company before. It's just that the nature of the company is like a new house built behind this facade that still uses its history and everything as a projection. But I think that once Eisner and Katzenberg took over, this was not the same Disney. And I do have a memory, because I got there just before Roy Disney was forced off the board. I don't understand. Like, again, I was so new into the industry, I don't understand what happened, but he specifically requested that all the animators receive like a special note. So we came into work, and on my animation desk that morning, there was this letter from him with a little watercolor drawing of Pinocchio. And he was apologizing to us. And that was his letter. He's like, I'm sorry that I could not, keep the company that is what you signed up for. It was something along those lines. I still have it. I think it's at my parents' place or something, but I'm just even thinking about that. Because all that I knew at the time, and again, I'm kind of just saying stuff from a memory that has not been fact checked, but I do remember that the conversation was something about how when Michael Eisner came in, it was like the board became Michael Eisner's brother-in-law, Michael Eisner's best friend, Michael Eisner's this or that. And they basically just unanimously forced Roy Disney out of the company, was what I understood. But I did actually, because I haven't read How to Read Donald Duck yet, which I really want to read. But I do have a question that I'm just curious about, like, because something that I brought this here just so I can remember. This is our Bible. If anybody wants to know about the history of Disney as told by Disney animators, this would be the book. But there was like an area in it, because they talk about the timeline, and I was just looking at it yesterday, and they were talking about how many people were in the studio. Like now I don't know if I can find it offhand, but they pointed out that like sometime in the 30s and 40s, the studio went from 40 people to like over 1,000. But they don't explain why. It's just kind of put like, oh, this just happened. And I'm just wondering, from people that have, like, I feel like maybe that's something that you've covered or talked about, but I also thought that was kind of interesting that somehow this massive amount of money came in the 40s.
Disney did personally a lot of war propaganda, like, and I mean like official war propaganda, not like not just cartoons that propagandized war, but actually made films. Like he made one actually that we referenced in one of our discussions that was, I forget what it's called exactly, but it's a big justification of mass aerial bombardment of civilians as a war technique. And so I don't know. Again, this is speculation. We'd have to like dig in and do research, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were, Pentagon contracts that came in at that time of, hey, I want to do some, we would like you to do war films, or, some combination of that, a conversation between Disney and Pentagon officials about that kind of stuff that then ended up underwriting a big growth. One quick thing, I mean, I think you said around 1915 would have been CIA. I just want to clarify, the CIA as it exists, there was a prior agency, but it comes post, like around and post World War II, really post World War II. But there was always, I mean, military propaganda and things like that were still, maybe you know that history a little better, Jared, actually.
Well, I was only going to add that because it was the Office of Special Services or something, the OSS, and then in that Alfred and Secker book, they point out that the first time you hear in well, popularly Central Intelligence Agency is in a Hollywood film that actually predates the advent of the. But I happen to I was trying to just look into things for today. And one of my favorite books on the history of mass communication is by Timothy Glander, talks about just in passing. And I don't know why I even had it highlighted from before. So I don't know what I saw before or what I was thinking about before, because it definitely wasn't this. But one of the things that was one of the bureaus established in 1917 under the Creel Commission was what they called the Bureau of Cartoons. So I know that this is mostly print and stuff like that, but the idea of the government funding at this point, it was $10 million in 1917. The idea of funding, at least in part, because it was like 15 different bureaus that they were established. This was one of them. That the idea of funding something from the federal government that would specifically target popular culture, and specifically in this case, even cartoons, for the purpose of preparing people for war, had already begun. So it makes perfect sense that Disney would have, they kind of the point I was making earlier, they were like, oh, he makes cartoons. They do somewhat popular. They're somewhat popular. We've already been funding the politicization and propagandization of cartoons. Let's ramp it up as this new medium is taking greater hold. I mean, it could have been just as simple as that. This mouse character, some numbers. This guy's a racist. It's a perfect relationship. It's, so yeah.
Renee, I don't know if you want to say anything about this, but you pulled this up. It looks like you mentioned that that
Like,
Snow White.
Listen, y'all can't be teasing me with like, go find something, because you know how I get. I was like, now I want to know. So it's interesting because, yes, Samantha, as you found in your book, it appears they went from 40 employees to 1,000 in less than a decade. It looks like it's about a 5 or 6 year span. But this seems to tie it to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which I think is interesting. That's the title. Like, according to this, they were at 300 people when they started Snow White. And by the time Snow White released and became like this worldwide phenomenon for Disney, they were at 1,000 and moved to Burbank. So,
Which could be, it was a big hit. I mean, like that's part of this too. And I think that's the thing about something like this, is it's not going to be all like, oh, the state intervened here, or this tech company relationship started up, and so then this scales everything up. I mean, there's multiple things going on, and especially in that period, I think too, part of what you're pointing to, Samantha, I think is really important in terms of Disney as a, because, and this ties into actually How to Read Donald Duck, because largely in that period, they're talking about Disney as a person, and as a person who runs a company, and that company's role within Empire. But I think it becomes quite different after he dies. And then there's, as you say, there's some period at which, I mean, Roy Disney, who's his brother, carries it on. It's also interesting you bring him up because his granddaughter, Abigail's the one who, I think she's an academic and actually published a documentary that's quite critical of the labor relations and things like that within Disney, like quite critical of her grandfather's company, along with Walt, her great uncle or whatever. And so, but there's a transition, right? And you get the Michael Eisner, kind of era, and then now we're into, what is it, Bob Iger, who's the chairman of Disney now. And so, you get this phase as it becomes this multinational, um, you know, uh, stockholder owned corporation. And it's also interesting too, because you're talking about Pixar and industrial sound and light. What is it? ILM, industrial light and
Industrial Light and Magic. Yeah.
magic, right? You're talking about them as sort of separate entities, but like if you go to Disney World now, or if you go to Disney Plus now, like all of this stuff is now owned by Disney, and so they might be managed separately on some level, but it's still like, is like the Disney cinematic universe, I mean, it's like, because Marvel's in there too. If you go to Disney World or Disneyland, they have parts of the parks that are dedicated to the Pixar stuff, parks that are dedicated to the Marvel stuff, parts that are dedicated to Star Wars and all of that, right? And like, so it is interesting, I think, to think about this kind of transition from a company that certainly has an ideological role, that is certainly, pro-imperial and its propaganda purposes and all of that, but then to this massive thing that we have today, where even if you try to look at Disney films, like lists of Disney films in recent years, it's so extensive now, because we're used to thinking about it of just like the animated movies, right? But that's not what they do anymore. That's a very small portion of what they do. And I think that's, there's a whole interesting study of that transition, I think, that, folks could do.
And I want Mtume's next, but I just also wanted to make sure we pointed out that the late 30s is when we start ramping up in Europe towards World War II.
That's what I was wondering. Yeah. Yes.
Well, that's partly what I was going to get to. Well, part of it is, so Disney then signed a distribution deal with RKO. So RKO Pictures, who people don't even remember anymore, RKO was one of the big studios in the 30s. That was a part of the help of the expansion, right? And then I just looked this up. I remembered, I'm reading about this a long time ago. They invented the multi-plane camera at that time also. So Disney became interesting because of also their technology developments to the studio system. So Walt basically had to make these, you become entwined with it. But the other part is, yes, I think people think that war propaganda films just started when we entered the war, but we were doing some that was actually pro-fascist. I mean, Cedric Roberts brings up in Forging Memories and Meaning, we were making films in support of Mussolini in the early 30s. They were coming directly out of Hollywood, right? And so Walt Disney having an interest in war propaganda, I'm sure this was part of the conversation. working with RKO, his expansion would be something that they would be interested in, because they're like, look, this works, we like this. And the American studio system was, like you said, totally involved in the military project, and also just the ideological project that was really becoming necessary, which is part of the military project, but the ideological project that was becoming necessary, as you know, they probably all kind of knew they were ramping up for something. At some point, they knew some kind of conflict. Well, they did. They all thought it would be against the Soviets. They all thought they were going to ramp up to go fight the Soviets. That's why they're going hanging out with Mussolini, and they're like making movies about him, right? But then, of course, there is the pivot because of the very things that happened with Hitler and so forth and so on, right?
Well,
but yeah, so they were gearing up. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, to the point that Jared makes in the private chat about supporting Nazis up into the 30s, that was the thing. They were ramping up, but they thought that they were going to be on the other side, and the other side
Right.
was going to not go too far. And you know, like if Hitler just would have chilled a little bit, if Mussolini and them would have chilled a little bit, and maybe shared a little bit more of Africa and Eastern Europe, they might have been good. It might have been a whole separate situation here. So yeah, but yeah. They knew they were ramping up for something.
Yeah, I think that's the other thing too, is that at least you know, this forever, like after World War II, at least the forever wars just seem to be the main theme, and also imposing that, you know, that kind of America is always right ideology, and that we're always right to intervene and just get the public, you know, constantly on board with this. That kind of mentality. I think that was, like, again, I don't think it was a shift away from fascism, but I think that this kind of sort of forever war global hegemony idea became at least much stronger after World War II. And I sort of see all the Pixar and Lucasfilm have so many underlying themes of this. Even in, like, I remember seeing Luca, which was this cute little Italian story with like mermaid boys that just want, like, it's like a Little Mermaid thing, that when they go on land they look like humans, but if they get wet, it was so disturbing to me, because it was this normalizing of like you know, of like integrating into American values, that you're only accepted if you don't tell anybody that you were an indigenous mer person, you know, or something. And it was just very, like, all of their films sort of have that theme under them.
I just wanted to quickly note that RKO and Disney worked together. I don't know if you mentioned that in your comments on RKO, Mtume, just now, but like Song of the South is an RKO Disney production combined. So
I didn't, but there you go.
Yeah.
They even gobbled up Hulu now. They said you can watch, you go to Disney Plus to see Hulu. And I know, you know, initially people thought it was going to be the other way around. So it's
like but on the animation side, like, you know, it's something that, like, there was, like, of the big studios, like, just even as artists, right? Like, there's very few studios that are not owned now by the Disney company, because there was Blue Sky in New York for a while, but then Disney bought them out, and they don't really exist anymore. But I mean, there's obviously like Sony or whatever, but like, and DreamWorks sort of has their own thing too. But for the most part, like, Disney has, at least for us, when we're looking for jobs or something, there's very little outside of the Disney umbrella at this point.
Yeah, and it's not just, I mean, it's ESPN is owned by Disney, right? So sports media is owned by Disney at this point, and of course ABC, that's their relationship goes back quite a ways. But it's actually interesting, because I think at one point I thought ABC would sort of buy out Disney, and the opposite happened, and that's the, you know, we live in the afterlife of that. Go ahead, Renee.
And then, no, I was just saying, and Fox, like, Disney bought Fox too. So like, it's all one, it's like all one big company.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because I don't know if folks have noticed it, but, you know, they bundle things. And so they've started to bundle HBO, which HBO is Time Warner. And I think that's also an interesting, like, the fact that they're now bundling that with Hulu and Disney Plus. You know, we may find soon that Disney Plus. I mean, it's wild because like I have a kid and I have Disney Plus, and you know, he logs on there and there's like Predator movies and like all of this stuff, like all these like all kinds of stuff that's just there now because it is totally just morphed into this like catch all for he could watch Snowfall if he wants to,
But they did own some like Touchstone and stuff like that too, right? It was a Disney property, I think. But sorry, just like coming back to that, like this is the thing that I find really interesting about like or at least because it's my bias or whatever, because it's my industry, it's sort of where I've anchored everything. But it's kind of like this whole thing, and that like, Disney animation, for example, was always like 5% or less of like the company, incomes. And yet, they keep it alive. And internally, we'd always be like, oh, well, because it's the legacy, like it's like something that means something, to Disney, or it's like something important to hold the company identity together. But it is very weird. And the same thing like with Katzenberg and DreamWorks, like DreamWorks was in its film animation, like just in what it was doing, it could not sustain itself on its own as a company. And so that's why I just feel like there's clearly like so much value, and maybe because it's targeting very young audiences as well. There's just so much, there's some reason that they really, really cling to keeping these studios alive, even if in the broader picture, they're not really like, anyone that's running a business would be like, why are these departments still existing or something?
Yeah, go ahead, Jared.
Yeah, so again, in just trying to think about contributions to this discussion, I was looking at one of those YouTube film industry channels that I like to go to, and they were having this argument about the go woke go broke argument that the white right is often pushing, and Disney is often at the center of these arguments. And the response to that I heard that I thought was really compelling, that relates to what we're talking about here, was that first of all, and I haven't checked these numbers, but the argument was made that first of all, Disney makes more from merchandising than they would make from the box office on the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe combined. So when people say this or that Disney film didn't do as well as they thought it should, and therefore because you put a black girl in there, or you made someone a woman, or or someone is gay now or something like that, they're like, this person will say, so all of that is nonsense and has nothing to do with that. For me, I heard the political argument of that, which goes back to a lot of what we've all been talking about, which is that the sales, the material profit is not necessarily from the film, at least from the initial box office, at least, or even streaming revenue, is not their number one interest. Now, you could put it in, as this person was saying, the context of toys and whatever else, t-shirts and rides at theme parks. I would put it in the realm of ideas and narratives and themes and stuff like that, which I think play for them an untold immaterial, has an untold immaterial value that is literally priceless. But all to the same point, that they are willing to, even if necessary, quote unquote, take a loss at the box office level, in the same way in traditional media there would be big owners willing to take losses and profits if they could control or dominate or have something to say about the narrative going out in the day's news. It just seemed to all, but yeah, there's a lot going on that there, so for those of us who would be looking for this or that, or even just a quality film, for a lot of it, they're like, it's irrelevant. If see it, don't see it, we're going to make it, it's going to be a Happy Meal, it's going to be t-shirts, it's going to be a theme park, it's going to be something elsewhere in the atmosphere. But they're always thinking beyond just something as immediate as a box office. So yeah, anyway, just thought that was interesting.
What you said, Jared, reminds me of the end of Network, right? By Sidney Lumet, right? When Howard Beale becomes unprofitable, what does Jensen say? I don't care. I like his message. And I think his message is necessary for the people. Because it's not Jensen who assassinates Beale. It's the people under who are like trying to keep the company alive. We're like, man, we're gonna lose the company. But Jensen, the hegemon, does not care, right? Especially after he has the meeting with Beale and he tells him his vision of the capitalist world, and Beale says, you know what? I like what Jensen has to say, and I'm gonna spew his message. He don't care. Jensen would have ran that company into the ground.
But I would have just posed one thing that's maybe the inverse of this, right? So you mentioned ants, and I remembered that there was this argument about ants, that I remember people who were pro-Marxist saying this and people who were anti-Marxist saying this, that ants was Marxist propaganda for kids. And that this was, let's see, it was 98. So one of the first, it was their first project and their second computer animated film after 1995. Oh, so it was the second. So it was after Pixar, right? But DreamWorks' first one. And it's funny too, because it's like you're saying, well, look, like they didn't have the technology to do humans. And also the development of this technology is part of how we get to US Predator drones and their ability to visualize, etc. And so on some level too, as folks on the left, when we think that we have something that's like, oh, this is actually good, like this story is, they're promoting our ideas here. It's like, well, maybe they are, but to what end, right? Like, what are they doing with the money and the research that they do in order to promote those ideas? And so, I think that, again, I mean, you brought up this point of like co-opting different audiences or bringing people in with different politics and bringing them into these spaces that they may be already somewhat antagonistic to because we have critiques, right? So what does it mean then to bring in the folks who are critical of, I mean, Disney is a horrible, like they're on the BDS list, and here we are all talking about multiple different products of theirs across multiple episodes, so yeah.
And can we just point out that ants like wildly like Marxist military propaganda? Like, can we just be clear that like that was a military movie and like the whole thing was like the military ants who protected the queen? Like, can we just like I'm just saying, like,
But I did watch it with the girls. And
I've seen
that's the one with Woody Allen
times.
in it. That's Woody Allen,
yes,
right? Because that's the one where I said, because I played up all the workers uniting and the people being conscripted as sellouts, and I did not tell them. I do remember that I was like, I didn't say who the voice was because I didn't want to acknowledge Woody Allen at all. But I was like, that's. But you're probably right. So I was on it's a revolutionary film. How did they get this snuck through the censors at whatchamacallit studio?
And this is what happens. This is what we do. That's why I need y'all to watch 40 Acres so somebody could slap me to tell me what I missed. Because so like it's the curse, man. Like we just, I don't know.
It's kind of sorry, because I was just thinking of this now too. It's just interesting because that was also this transitional period is when celebrity voice actors started becoming a thing. Because I don't know if you remember, but like in Beauty and the Beast and in Little Mermaid, like even though that was part of the golden age, those earlier films didn't have celebrity voice actors. Like they would do auditions and they would have actor. I mean, they might have been known in their own circles. Like I think the guy that voiced the Beast came from some Broadway, like had theater Broadway background or something, but they didn't get these really known names in. So it just popped into my head, but I was like, it's just kind of interesting that it kind of collides with that timeline as well, bringing in celebrities.
That's how they get us, man.
Yeah.
I mean, also, like a lot of that stuff also has to do with how the business changed within like the way agents, agencies, and management companies work. a lot of those things also reshuffled because agencies and management companies now help produce films. You know, they are entrenched in it. So this kind of these, you know, and people getting things on big packages now. It's weird. If you look at Hollywood, how it works is like there was a studio system that was established early. Then you had the big financial failure of the studio system in the 60s, failures, where you had to kind of reconstruct for like 20 to 30, 40 years. And now it's just kind of reconfigured into a new kind of studio system that no one wants to really admit is a lot like the old one in many ways. Package deals. If you want Tom Cruise, you have to take my new young actor and put them in the movie with it, right? You make like an 8-thing package with this cartoon and so forth and so on. I mean, it's part of it. So they're always looking for new, you know, revenue and new ways to kind of dominate. And so it's yeah. So it doesn't surprise me that they would do that. That's a good point. I never really thought about that now it's all movie stars.
Well, I appreciate all the commentary, all the folks in the chat. There's probably a couple comments I could bring up in the chat. Samantha, was there anything else that we didn't really touch on today, or that you had more you wanted to bring on today? I know that we'll have more conversations with you on our different platforms, but yeah, go ahead.
No, I think I just sort of, it just popped into my mind too, because you had brought up Zootopia before. I don't know if like, you know, there's, I mean, like, it's obviously propaganda, but I just wanted to comment and say that initially when Byron Howard was developing Zootopia and stuff, it was going to be like a Three Musketeers thing. And this is all like, if you get the Art of book, it's like, what's really interesting is in the Art of Zootopia, the preface is by our good friend, John Lasseter. And it was when John Lasseter got into creative stories and get sort of fleshing out how are we going to, you know, produce Zootopia, it turned into like the idea of it being a cop story was presented. So I kind of, the more that I'm like reading things too, I find that like our friend John is like just sort of, and that was what was just so weird, because that's what he would do. He just walks around the studios all the time, like, and he's just always there, just kind of, I guess. And the more that, like, I just think he must, like, I don't know, I just see him, he must be like a mediator or something, but like that was the only thing. And you know, just stuff that the state involvement, because when you look at DreamWorks and Katzenberg too, like Katzenberg was one of Obama's biggest, or like, I think he's one of Obama's biggest sponsors, and Obama was invited to come and hang out at DreamWorks like all the time. He was always there. And so there's, you know, there's this whole, like, again, like there's just, I'm just pointing out things that I think are good to be curious about maybe. And
we could do a whole thing on Zootopia, and I swear it's just because I wrote it down, because all of a sudden all these reels keep popping up about Zootopia on my doom scroll whenever I'm like,
Zootopia's
like,
it's because the second one's about to come out.
That's right. But it's, so the one I saw this morning, I was like, damn, I never even thought about it that way. He's pointing out how in Zootopia, they spend the entire movie pointing out these like preconceived ideas about people, right? And it's all like, look, the fox is sneaky, right? But it's, you know, it's profiling, but then the fox turns out to be sneaky. So like, it's all this like effort to prove that all the stereotypes you have in your mind are actually real things, and it's okay to have them because they're all real. Like, we could do a whole thing on Zootopia because it's wild.
Yes,
I thought you were going to say oh, my bad. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I thought you were going to say we could do a whole thing on Obama in film. Especially now that the Obamas are now greenlighting and producing films.
I don't want to talk about him at all.
Yeah. I just say too, I mean, like, you know, you can get very conspiratorial about all of this and say the, you know, specific people are placed in these specific roles to do these things, which may be. I'm not I'm not like opposed to that idea totally. But there's also just like that these folks they develop these relationships with these different forces, and they feel some of them are true believers, right? Like, hey, I'm an imperialist, I'm a Zionist, and I'm a liberal, I'm all of the above. And they wouldn't necessarily say it in those ways, right? But their values and the things that they believe in connect into these different spheres, right? I believe in America. I believe we have to have a strong military. I believe in Israel as the defense of Western civilization against barbarism. Like, these are the ways that folks think, and that somebody who thinks like that is very useful to people and rises through the ranks, often because those
So,
forces
so
say,
you're
hey,
saying that's why LeBron James was caught on film dancing at the wedding party? That's what you're saying?
I missed this. I'm sorry. I don't know the reference.
Go
You're not
ahead,
gonna.
Jared.
I was about to derail this whole show. I'm gonna let that one go. I'll let that one. I'm gonna let that one
LeBron
go.
James was dancing at what's the Microsoft guy's wedding, and when they shut down half the island, he was at the wedding, and there's a whole reel of him like dancing amongst all the rich and famous. So I was actually riling up Jared on purpose. I'm sorry, I can't even stay here much longer. I'm messing around getting Jared started, and
I'm gonna go outside. I'm gonna be in the backyard in a minute, screaming into the wind about my LeBron stuff in a second, but not today. Not here.
LeBron is quite useful to Empire. I would agree with that statement. All right, so Erica Kane's folks should check out the mapping militarization map on Black Alliance for Peace's website, and the video on how to apply it on BAP's YouTube. Definitely check that out. Parenti has gotten some credit for his classic Inventing Reality, but he also has one called Make Believe Media, which is about film and TV. That would be a good one to do a study group on at some point, maybe. And Zootopia said Hillary Clinton was right. All right. I appreciate you all. This was a lot of, very interesting. Always learn a lot when I hear, your conversation, Samantha, and it's always good to be in conversation with you, Renee, Jared, Mtume. And I do know folks have other Sunday commitments with their families. I don't know what day it is. Tomorrow we have Dr. Lara Shihai back on the show. She recently went to Lebanon. She'll be talking a little bit about that, as well as all the psychic intrusions going on, and all that good stuff. And then on Tuesday we have the Year of the Dragon with Gemma DeCristo on Imperial 80s. And then on Wednesday we're going to have Adnan Hussein on the show. And I think we're going to delve into Christian Zionism a bit and kind of get into some of that stuff. So I'm sure that, Samantha, we'll be seeing you more. We'd love to have you back. We should do another one of these in, sometime soon. We could figure out, maybe we do the Zootopia.
When does Zootopia, Naz, when does Zootopia 2 come out? I'm asking my child because he'll know. I don't know.
I think it's this winter.
It's winter, right? Like soon. All right, so maybe we got to figure that out. I think that would be a good one. All right, he just told me. The child always knows. November 26th. He just gave me the drop.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much. I'm gonna let us out of here. Appreciate you. Appreciate the chat. Make sure to like, share, subscribe on your way out if you have not done so already.